Everyone thought the T-62 was finished. It had been removed from active service, pushed into storage, and written off as a relic of another era. Yet, decades later, this forgotten Cold War tank suddenly reappeared where nobody expected to see it. Why would a military bring back a vehicle designed more than half a century ago? What was hidden inside the massive storage depots for all those years? And why has the T-62 become the center of so many arguments, rumors, and controversies? If you're interested in tanks, secret military projects, and forgotten war machines, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There are many more fascinating stories ahead. Enjoy the video, and let's continue. Today, we're uncovering the story of a tank that refused to disappear, a machine that outlived generations of armored vehicles and made one of the most surprising comebacks in modern military history. In 2022, many military equipment enthusiasts were truly surprised. Suddenly, T-62 tanks appeared in footage from the combat zone, machines that most had considered long consigned to history.
For some, it became a sensation. For others, a reason for dispute, and some even rushed to declare it a sign of serious problems. After all, only recently it seemed obvious that the era of the T-62 had long since ended. For many years, the Russian army was associated with completely different tanks. The news regularly reported on modernized T-72s, updated T-80s, and the latest T-90s. These were the machines called the backbone of the country's tank forces. At military parades, exercises, and international exhibitions, the public's attention was focused on them. It seemed that everything else remained only a part of Cold War history. Therefore, the appearance of the T-62 raised many questions. How did a tank designed back in the early 60s of the last century become in demand again? Why did a machine that many considered completely written off appear again alongside modern armored vehicles? And most importantly, was its return really a forced measure, as numerous commentators claimed, or were the reasons completely different? Bloggers and self-proclaimed experts began discussing this topic especially actively. In the information space, loud statements quickly appeared that the old machines had allegedly to be urgently returned to service. Some spoke of a catastrophic shortage of equipment. Others claimed that the warehouses were already empty, and others made even bolder assumptions. However, behind the bright headlines, there was often a lack of understanding of what was actually happening with armored vehicles during modern combat operations. The fact is that any army in the world lives not only with the latest models of weapons. Over decades of operation, huge reserves of equipment accumulate, which can remain useful even after more modern machines take their place on the front line. Sometimes, such models remain in reserve for decades, waiting for their hour.
And their presence does not always mean backwardness or a lack of something. On the contrary, in many cases, this is a sign of a far-sighted approach to preserving resources. The history of the T-62 is just such a case. At first glance, it may seem that we are talking about an old tank that accidentally escaped scrapping. But if you carefully study its fate, it becomes clear that everything is much more interesting. Over decades of service, this machine managed to pass through many wars, survive several major upgrades, and repeatedly prove that writing it off ahead of time would be a mistake. The most curious thing is that the T-62 actually turned into a kind of ghost tank. It was almost not talked about. It was rarely mentioned in the news. It disappeared from the focus of experts and military equipment enthusiasts. Many were convinced that these machines remained only on the pages of reference books and archival photographs. However, the reality turned out to be completely different. While the public's attention was riveted to the latest developments, thousands of units of various armored vehicles continued to be at storage bases. These machines remained out of the sight of the general audience for decades. And that is exactly where the answer lay to the question that suddenly interested a huge number of people in 2022. Where the T-62s actually came from, who kept them in working order, and why an old Soviet tank became needed by the army again after many decades is a separate story that begins long before the events of recent years. While disputes flared up around the appearance of the T-62, much less attention was paid to another question. Where were all these machines for the previous decades? After all, a tank cannot simply disappear from the army and then suddenly appear again. Behind this is always a huge system of storage, maintenance, and accounting of equipment which was created back in the Soviet era. After the end of the Cold War, Russia inherited colossal reserves of armored vehicles. Dozens of thousands of tanks of various types were in service and in reserve. Obviously, it was impossible to maintain such a number of vehicles in combat units. A significant part of the equipment was gradually sent to special storage bases, where it could remain for many years waiting for its further fate. For most people, such bases are represented by endless rows of rusting machines in the open air. In reality, the situation is much more complex. Of course, decades of downtime do not pass without a trace for any equipment. Rubber elements age, electronics require testing, and mechanisms need maintenance. However, the very idea of such reserves is precisely to return vehicles to service, if necessary, significantly faster than producing new ones from scratch. The T-62 turned out to be one of those tanks that was destined for exactly such a fate. After being withdrawn from combat units, hundreds of machines went to storage bases. Over the years, reports appeared about plans for their disposal, but a significant part of the tanks continued to remain in reserve. Moreover, from time to time, experts proposed new options for modernizing these machines, which indirectly indicated that interest in their further operation was maintained. Curiously, long before the events of 2022, the T-62 already reminded people of itself. Attentive observers could notice these machines in the armies of other states, as well as in various armed conflicts outside Russia. This meant that the old tank was still capable of performing combat tasks, especially where the use of the most modern equipment was not required. Nevertheless, for the general public, the T-62 continued to remain an almost forgotten veteran.
News about the newest tanks attracted much more attention than reports about machines created in the last century. That is why its return later turned out to be so unexpected. People simply did not imagine how much equipment was still in reserve and how diverse this supply could be. When the special military operation began, the army faced tasks that many analysts initially underestimated. At the initial stages, discussions usually boiled down to comparing the latest models of weapons and their characteristics. However, real practice quite quickly showed that modern war requires not only high-tech machines, but also a large amount of reliable equipment to solve a wide variety of tasks. It was then that the attitude towards reserve vehicles began to gradually change. Old tanks ceased to be perceived exclusively as museum exhibits or candidates for scrapping. They began to be viewed again as a resource that could bring practical benefit.
Moreover, this was not about replacing modern T-72, T-80, or T-90, but about the competent distribution of equipment depending on specific conditions and tasks. Many mistakenly imagine tank warfare as continuous, large-scale clashes of armored formations. In reality, a significant part of the work of armored vehicles is related to supporting infantry. strengthening defensive lines, acting as part of reserves, and launching fire strikes on identified enemy positions. For such tasks, the most expensive and modern machine at the Army's disposal is not always required. There was another important reason. The modern battlefield is literally saturated with anti-tank weapons. Missile systems, artillery, attack drones, and various types of high-precision weapons have made life much more difficult for any armored vehicle. Under such conditions, even the most modern machines are forced to act cautiously, and the issue of rational use of resources comes to the fore. At first glance, light tanks could provide a solution to this problem. However, a serious contradiction arises here. To maintain high mobility and the ability to overcome difficult terrain, such machines have to be made relatively light, and this inevitably affects the level of protection of the crew and the equipment itself. The more actively anti-tank weapons develop, the stronger the desire to strengthen the armor of light machines becomes. But as soon as the mass begins to increase, the advantages for which they were created disappear. Mobility decreases, transportation becomes more complicated, and sometimes the very concept of the machine changes completely. As a result, a kind of vicious circle arises, from which it is not so easy to find a way out. It is here that the T-62 is unexpectedly recalled. An old Soviet tank does not claim the role of a newest combat vehicle. It is not capable of replacing modern main battle tanks and was not created for that. However, in terms of protection, it is noticeably superior to many light armored vehicle models, while maintaining the relative simplicity of design and operation. Gradually, it became obvious that such machines could have their own niche. Not a main role on the battlefield, not a struggle for the title of the most modern tank, but the fulfillment of specific tasks where the use of more expensive equipment is not the most rational solution. But to understand why the T-62 was even able to claim such a role decades after its appearance, it is necessary to return to the beginning of its history, at a time when this tank was considered one of the most advanced in the world. By the beginning of the 21st century, the armies of many countries faced a problem that was difficult to imagine even a few decades ago. The battlefield was changing rapidly. If earlier the tank's main enemy was most often another tank, now the danger could come from almost any direction.
Anti-tank missile systems were becoming more sophisticated, artillery more accurate, and reconnaissance tools allowed for detecting targets at long distances. Against this background, special attention began to be paid to light armored vehicles. It seemed that high mobility could compensate for the lack of protection. Fast machines could quickly change positions, accompany infantry, and operate where heavy tanks faced limitations. However, actual practice showed that such a concept has its weaknesses. Any light armored vehicle is forced to seek a compromise between mass, armament, and protection. It is impossible to endlessly reinforce armor while maintaining previous mobility. Each additional reinforcement leads to an increase in weight, and with it, new limitations appear. At some point, the equipment begins to lose the advantages for which it was created. This became especially noticeable in the conditions of modern conflicts.
The more weapons appeared on the battlefield, the more often the desire to strengthen crew protection arose. Designers looked for various solutions, added new armor elements, improved protection systems, but it was impossible to completely get rid of the contradiction between mass and protection. As a result, the question of intermediate-class equipment arose more and more often. Machines that are not light, but at the same time remain sufficiently simple, reliable, and mass-produced. It was here that it was unexpectedly discovered that some old tanks are capable of performing tasks that were previously considered secondary. The T-62 turned out to be one of such examples. It cannot be called modern by the standards of the 21st century. It is inferior to the newest machines in many respects and is not capable of competing with them on equal terms. However, its design was originally created as the design of a full-fledged tank, not a light armored vehicle.
This means a different level of protection, a different weight distribution, and a completely different safety margin. For a number of tasks, such qualities turned out to be more important than the presence of the most modern technologies. An old tank could be used where the use of expensive machines looked redundant. At the same time, it retained serious armament and protection unavailable to most light armored vehicle models. But to understand why, more than half a century after its creation, the T-62 is still able to find application, it is necessary to return to the beginning of its history. After all, once this tank was not considered an obsolete veteran at all. On the contrary, at the moment of its appearance, it was perceived as one of the most advanced combat vehicles of its time. The beginning of the 60s became a period of rapid development of tank building. The world watched closely as the leading powers tried to create a new generation of armored vehicles capable of surpassing everything that existed before. The Soviet Union was actively involved in this race, constantly improving its tank forces and developing more and more powerful machines. By this moment, the Soviet industry had already accumulated huge experience in creating armored vehicles. However, the military clearly understood that one should not stop at what had been achieved. The development of anti-tank weapons required a constant increase in firepower and an increase in the effectiveness of armament. That is why work began on a tank that was supposed to take the next step forward. This is how the T-62 appeared. At first glance, it retained many features of its predecessors, but inside were hidden solutions that made it a truly special machine. The main feature was a new 115mm smoothbore gun. For its time, this was an extremely serious innovation. Before the appearance of the T-62, most of the world's tanks used rifled guns. Soviet designers decided to go a different way. A smoothbore gun allowed a projectile to be accelerated to a significantly higher speed, which had a positive effect on armor penetration and the effectiveness of firing at protected targets. In fact, we were talking about a new stage in the development of tank armament. For the early 60s, such characteristics looked impressive. The tank received powerful armament, a reliable diesel engine, and sufficiently serious protection. All this made it a dangerous opponent for most of the machines that existed at that time. It is not surprising that the appearance of the T-62 aroused great interest both among the allies of the Soviet Union and among its potential adversaries. At the same time, the machine was not an experimental project or a rare sample of equipment. It was originally created for mass production and widespread use in the troops. That is why the T-62 soon began to arrive in tank units, and its history began to rapidly gain momentum. Then, no one could have assumed that this tank would survive several generations of armored vehicles, manage to take part in a multitude of armed conflicts, and decades later find itself in the center of attention again. But the first signs of future longevity were already noticeable. The designers created a machine with a large margin of capabilities, and this quality often becomes the main secret of the long service of any military equipment. Very quickly, it became clear that the T-62 would not remain a machine exclusively for the Soviet Army. Mass production allowed the tank to be produced in huge series, and its combination of firepower, reliability, and a comparatively simple design made it attractive to many states. As a result,
The geography of T-62 operation turned out to be so wide that today this tank can be called one of the most common models of armored vehicles of the second half of the 20th century. Over the years of production, which lasted from the early 60s to the mid-70s, about 20,000 machines of various modifications were built. For its time, these were colossal figures. Tanks were supplied to allies of the USSR on different continents, and some states later established their own production of equipment created on the basis of the Soviet design. Special interest in the machine was shown by countries that needed a relatively modern and, at the same time, undemanding tank. The T-62 did not require complex maintenance infrastructure, could be operated in the most diverse climatic conditions, and stood up well to long service. These qualities made it in demand far beyond the borders of the Soviet Union.
Over time, the tank became a participant in a huge number of armed conflicts. The Middle East, Africa, Asia, the Caucasus. It is difficult to find a region where the T-62 did not manage to leave its mark. Some machines fought as part of regular armies, others fell into the hands of various armed formations, and others continued their service decades after release. For designers and the military, such practice became a kind of testing ground lasting for decades. Each conflict revealed the strengths and weaknesses of the machine. Combat experience was constantly being accumulated, allowing for a better understanding of which elements of the design required improvement and which solutions turned out to be truly successful. It was thanks to this long operation that it became obvious that the potential of the T-62 was far from exhausted. Despite the appearance of new generations of tanks, the old machine continued to demonstrate viability.
Of course, the requirements for armored vehicles gradually changed. Means of destruction became more powerful, detection systems improved, and the nature of combat operations became more complicated. However, the tank itself retained a solid foundation, which allowed for thoughts about its further development. By the beginning of the 80s, military experts already understood well that the T-62 fleet remained too numerous to simply abandon. A huge number of machines continued to be in service, which meant a solution was required that would allow their service to be extended and their combat capabilities increased without creating completely new equipment. Thus began one of the most interesting stages in the history of this tank. Instead of sending thousands of machines to storage or replacing them all at once with new models, a decision was made to carry out a large-scale modernization. In fact, it was an attempt to breathe new life into a well-known design. The work turned out to be significantly more serious than it might seem at first glance. The designers understood that simply replacing individual devices would no longer allow compliance with the requirements of the time. It was necessary to comprehensively increase the survivability of the machine, improve its capabilities for detecting and engaging targets, and increase effectiveness in modern combat conditions. One of the first directions of modernization was the strengthening of protection. Additional armor elements and special anti-cumulative screens appeared on the tank. All this allowed for increasing the machine's resistance to the most common means of destruction of that period. For the crew, such changes were of great importance, since they directly affected safety during the execution of combat tasks. An equally important step was the improvement of the fire control system. If early versions of the T-62 were created in an era when many operations were performed almost manually, the new modifications received more modern equipment. A laser rangefinder and a ballistic computer appeared on the tank, significantly increasing firing accuracy. Now the crew could faster determine the distance to the target and more effectively use the gun's capabilities. The Drozd Active Protection Complex deserves special attention. For its time, this solution looked almost revolutionary. The system was capable of detecting approaching anti-tank ammunition and taking measures for their neutralization even before hitting the machine. Such technologies were just beginning to develop, so the appearance of such a complex on a serial tank became a very noticeable event. In parallel, the power plant was also modernized. More powerful engines allowed for compensating for the increase in mass caused by the strengthening of protection. The machine maintained mobility and remained sufficiently dynamic for its class. This was especially important as excessive weighting could negate all the advantages of modernization. It was during this period that the most well-known versions of the tank appeared, the T-62M and T-62MV. They were the result of a deep review of the basic machine's capabilities and effectively turned into new variants of the well-known tank. The T-62MV version, which received Contact 1 dynamic protection, became especially noticeable. Its characteristic appearance immediately gave away serious changes compared to early modifications. As a result, by the mid-80s, the T-62 represented a completely different tank from the one that first appeared in service in the early 60s. Behind the external similarity lay a large volume of changes that affected the protection, armament, sighting complexes, and the overall effectiveness of the machine. It would seem that after such an update, the T-62 received everything necessary for long service. However, ahead of it were new trials that would show how successful the carried-out modernization turned out to be, and why this tank would again remind people of itself even after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The collapse of the Soviet Union became a serious test for all military equipment that was in service with the huge country. Many models of weapons found themselves in a completely new reality. Funding was reduced, the army's structure was changing, and the quantity of equipment significantly exceeded the real needs of the armed forces. Under these conditions, the military had to make difficult decisions about which machines to keep in service and which to gradually withdraw from operation. The T-62 turned out to be among those tanks whose fate remained uncertain for a long time. On the one hand, more modern T-72, T-80, and other new generation machines were already arriving. On the other hand, a huge fleet of 62s still represented a serious resource that was difficult to ignore. In the 90s and the beginning of the new century, these tanks continued to be actively used in various operations in the North Caucasus. There, their simplicity, maintainability, and ability to work in difficult conditions were especially valued. Machines developed back in the Cold War era proved to be in demand in real combat operations again. It was then that the T-62 received another important chance to prove its consistency. Despite the age of the design, the tanks continued to fulfill their assigned tasks. Of course, they were no longer perceived as the pinnacle of technical progress. However, the experience of operations showed that it was too early to completely write them off. Nevertheless, time moved forward. More and more attention was paid to the modernization of the T-72 and T-80, as well as the development of new models of armored vehicles. Against this background, the T-62 gradually receded into the shadows. In the information space, reports about the withdrawal of these machines from combat units appeared more and more often. Especially actively, such conversations were conducted at the beginning of the second decade of the 21st century. Information appeared about hundreds of tanks prepared for scrapping. Many were convinced that the history of the T-62 was approaching its logical conclusion. It seemed that a little more, and this tank would finally remain only in museums, archives, and the memories of military specialists. However, what happened was what had repeatedly happened to the T-62 throughout its history. It refused to disappear again. Despite numerous statements about the imminent end of service, a significant number of machines continued to remain at storage bases. Moreover, interest in the possibilities of their further development suddenly began to return. At first glance, such interest looked strange. Why invest funds in a tank that is already several decades old? Why do specialists continue to deal with a machine that has long given way to more modern models? The answer lay in the fact that the basic design still possessed a certain potential for modernization. That is why, at the beginning of the 2000s, new projects for updating the T-62 appeared. One of the most noticeable became the variant developed by specialists of the Omsk Design Bureau of Transport Machine Building. In fact, we were no longer talking about cosmetic changes, but about a serious rework of many of the machine's systems. The designers sought to bring the capabilities of the old tank as close as possible to the requirements of the new time. Modern communication means, improved fire control systems, and new sighting complexes appeared on the modernized machines.
Special attention was paid to increasing firing accuracy and improving target detection capabilities. One of the most interesting innovations was the use of the Shexner guided weapon complex. Thanks to it, the tank received the ability to use special guided ammunition launched directly through the barrel channel of the main gun. For a machine created back in the early 60s, such a solution looked quite impressive. At the same time, work continued on strengthening protection. The use of more modern elements of dynamic protection allowed for significantly increasing the tank's resistance to various threats. Power plants were also improved, which had a positive effect on the machine's mobility even after the installation of additional equipment. All these projects demonstrated one important thing. Despite its considerable age, the design of the T-62 remained sufficiently flexible for further development.
That is why, from time to time, interest in the tank arose again, although until a certain moment, it did not move into large-scale practical programs. It seemed that the modernizations would remain interesting experiments for exhibitions and presentations. However, the events of the beginning of the 20s changed the situation again. A particularly curious project was the one presented in 2021 by specialists of the 103rd Armored Repair Plant. It was this variant that would later become the subject of numerous discussions and disputes. Unlike previous modernization programs, the main emphasis here was placed on increasing the capabilities for observation and target detection. The creators clearly understood that the modern battlefield requires not only good protection and powerful armament. No less important becomes the skill of being the first to spot the enemy. Therefore, the tank received a new sight with a thermal imaging channel. Such equipment allowed for working effectively in conditions of limited visibility, at night, and in adverse weather. For a machine of this generation, such an update was of huge importance. But the most unusual element of the modernization was a special retractable mast with a complex of optical electronic equipment. After deployment, it rose several meters above the tank's hull and allowed for observation of the terrain while remaining in cover. Modern means of observation were placed on the mast, including television cameras, thermal imagers, and a laser rangefinder. Such a solution looked quite non-standard and immediately attracted the attention of specialists. In fact, the tank received additional capabilities for reconnaissance and observation which were previously unavailable to it. Interestingly, this project appeared even before the start of the special military operation. At that moment, it did not arouse much interest from the general audience and did not become a subject of loud discussions. Most observers continued to follow the newest tanks, considering them to be the main direction of development of armored vehicles. However, soon after, the situation changed. Information about orders for the modernization of the T-62 again attracted attention to the machine that many had long considered a page of history. And it was then that numerous rumors, myths, and assumptions began to be born around the old Soviet tank, some of which quickly flew around the whole world. As soon as the T-62 appeared in the combat zone again, a real information noise arose around it almost instantly. The old Soviet tank unexpectedly found itself in the center of attention, not only of military specialists, but also of journalists, bloggers, and numerous commentators. Moreover, it was often not the machine itself that was discussed, but various versions of the reasons for its appearance. Some claimed that the return of the T-62 allegedly testified to the complete exhaustion of stocks of modern equipment. Others spoke of the mass use of tanks that had been without maintenance for decades. Others published loud statements about the allegedly huge losses of these machines almost immediately after their appearance at the front. Such statements quickly spread in the information space because the old tank itself looked like an extremely convenient object for creating sensational headlines. The history of a machine designed more than half a century ago was ideal for loud publications. However, the real situation, as it often happens, turned out to be much more complex. The main problem of most such assessments lay in the attempt to consider the T-62 as a direct replacement for modern main battle tanks. It was from here that many erroneous conclusions were born. When an old machine was compared with the newest versions of the T-72, T-80, or T-90, the result was known in advance. But such a comparison did not initially reflect its real purpose. In practice, the T-62 performed completely different tasks. It was not returned for participation in the most complex tank duels, and not to make it the backbone of the armored forces. The machine was used where its capabilities were sufficient for solving specific tasks, and the use of more expensive equipment looked like a less rational option. Many disputes were also caused by reports of the losses of these tanks. In various publications, statements regularly appeared about a large number of destroyed or captured machines. However, if one carefully studies the available materials, it becomes obvious that many such assertions were based on isolated photographs or unconfirmed information. At the same time, one should not forget about the age of the machines themselves. A significant part of the T-62s were produced decades ago. Even after repair and modernization, equipment of this age inevitably faces the risk of various technical malfunctions. Therefore, isolated cases of machines going out of service are not something surprising at all. What is much more interesting is something else. Despite numerous disputes and criticism, the T-62 continued to be used, and this means that the military saw a certain practical value in it. Otherwise, no one would have spent time, resources, and production capacity on the restoration and modernization of such elderly equipment. It is here that we approach the main question of this entire story. What could a tank created back in the early 60s be needed for in a modern conflict? The answer might seem unexpected. Modern war is not only the newest technologies, the most complex electronics, and the most expensive models of weapons. It is also a huge need for reliable, mass-produced, and sufficiently protected equipment capable of performing a wide range of tasks daily. Not every machine needs to be the most modern. Not every operation requires the use of the best models of armored vehicles. Sometimes, the presence of a sufficient number of serviceable tanks that can support infantry, strengthen defensive positions, act as part of reserves, or perform the role of mobile firing points is much more important. In such conditions, the T-62 looks completely different. Before us is not an obsolete symbol of the past, but a specialized tool for solving specific tasks. Its simple design facilitates maintenance, and the decades of operational experience accumulated allow for quickly preparing the machines for work. Of course, the T-62 is not capable of replacing modern main battle tanks. It does not possess the level of protection, electronics, and combat capabilities that the latest generations of armored vehicles have.
However, no one sets such a task for it. Its role lies in something else. Where there is no need to use more complex and expensive equipment, the old tank is capable of effectively doing its job. That is why, decades after the completion of serial production, it proved to be in demand again. And this is the main paradox of the entire story. A machine that many considered hopelessly obsolete managed to survive several generations of tanks, the collapse of a state, numerous military reforms, and cardinal changes in the nature of combat operations. Moreover, it proved its ability to find a place in a completely new era again. What aspect of the T-62's history or its modern utility would you like to explore in more detail? The history of the T-62 began in the early 60s as the story of just another Soviet tank. But over time, it turned into something much greater. This tank managed to take part in dozens of conflicts, visit different continents, survive numerous upgrades, and avoid final retirement from the stage several times. For many years, it was alternately called promising, then considered obsolete, then prepared for decommissioning, and then returned to service again. And every time, the T-62 found a way to remind people of itself. Even today, no one can say with absolute certainty when its service will finally end. Perhaps there will be new upgrades, new tasks, and new chapters in the biography of this machine. But one thing is already obvious. Few tanks in world history have been able to travel such a long path. The T-62 has long ceased to be just a piece of armored equipment. It has become a clear example of how a successful engineering idea can survive for decades.